Hello, people. I hope you guys had an absolutely wonderful weekend. I know I did. It's Sunday night and tomorrow's Monday, and I'm trying to find a way to cheer myself up. My weekend was pretty good, I will say overall. It's really, really cold again. I don't know who decided to wake winter up and tell them to start doing their job again, but maybe about a week ago or two, she decided to clock in. I don't know, maybe send us an email next time. When it's cold outside, I really, really don't want to be outside, like, at all. So I'm kind of gagged a little bit because it was giving April, May, spring temperatures just a couple weeks ago. But, you know, without complaining too much, I have had a pretty good weekend. I'm almost at the end of season 1 of How to Get Away with Murder. Don't ask me why I'm 10 years late, but listen, it happened eventually. But oh yeah, my weekend was pretty good overall. And of course, it is time for me to do Zay Historicizes again on our designated Sunday evenings or Sunday nights. So today I figured what better discussion to have than really the Department of Education. The Department of Education has been such a hotbed topic for several months now. I do believe it actually, at least I started hearing the conversations for the first time last year when I guess Project 2025 was revealed for the Trump administration. And the Department of Education is a department that they are most definitely 100% going for. Elon Musk has implied that it no longer exists, but it has just been, I mean, it's just been a constant with the Department of Education. And, you know, opinions are here, opinions are there. But before, of course, I could really give my opinion on the Department of Education, I had to historicize it. And in order for me to historicize it, I had to look into what the department actually does in the first place. So the Department of Education does date back mainly to the 1950s in its original incarnation. The Department of Education was actually initially part of the Federal Department of Health, Welfare, and Education, but it did split in 1979, and that was under the Carter administration. President Carter felt that it was just an initiative for the federal government to really push for educational standards across the board in the United States. And in 1980, the Department of Education did become official. And I just wanted to go ahead, first of all, to just read some of the 4 key functions of the Department of Education. So 1, the department establishes policies on federal financial aid for education and distributing, as well as monitoring those funds, collecting data on America's schools, and disseminating research, focusing national attention on key issues in education, and makes recommendations for education reform, as well as prohibiting discrimination and ensuring equal access to education. So a lot of what the Department of Education does, it just so happens to be part of the DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusivity initiatives that were really popular in the 1960s during the civil rights, specifically under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. And I just wanted to list a couple of the things that the department does, as well as some of the DEI and civil rights era acts that they are tied to. So the Department of Education, it does fund IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what this does is just ensures that students with disabilities, those be physical or mental, are accommodated for in the American public school system. It also includes Title I, which is the distribution of funding to schools and school districts with a high percentage of students from marginalized or disenfranchised communities. So this actually dates back to LBJ's War on Poverty, and that act specifically was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And it was specifically to combat racial segregation and the achievement gap, which, you know, the United States started monitoring at that period. The Department of Education also functions with the Pell Grants, grants that are given to students with exceptional financial need. So these are students who are either they have not yet achieved their bachelor's, or they are attending or enrolled in post-secondary education. The Department of Education is just making sure that these students have access to funds based on, you know, exceptional financial needs. You know, they don't necessarily have the funds to pay for college and things like that. And these are not loans, so they do not have to be repaid. So, you know, those are just some of the things that the Department of Education does. And that specifically with Pell Grants was part of LBJ's Higher Education Act of 1965. So again, all of these date back to that exact same era. In my last video, when I talked about the myth of the model minority and just DEI initiatives and where that comes from, out of the Civil Rights Act in particular, the Voting Rights Act, Equal Opportunity Act, all of those things, they all date back to really the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, which would have been the administration during the era of civil rights in this country. So even though the department is not formed until 1979 and begins functioning in 1980, the department does really put into practice a lot of the initiatives that would have been signed by Lyndon Bates Johnson, you know, back in the mid 1960s. So that is just some background on the Department of Education and what they actually do, because I'm not going to lie to you, I didn't exactly know what they did, but, you know, obviously through my research, I was able to, you know, most definitely see, you know, just the functionalities of that department. So that is some background on the Department of Education and exactly what they do. But the backlash against the Department of Education is absolutely not a new thing at all by the far right or the GOP. As far back as 1980, Ronald Reagan, during his presidential election, actually promised to abolish the Department of Education, which is so funny because in May of 1980, that's really when the department came into effect as being its own, you know, segment of, you know, the federal government, one of the agencies in the federal government. So it is very, you know, interesting, of course, that Ronald Reagan immediately went to really abolish the, you know, the Department of Education. During the 1980s, we do see a lot of push by Republicans to completely abolish the department. And I did want to read a quote from 1996, and this was during the 1996 presidential election, where on the GOP platform level, this is what was said about the Department of Education. The federal government has no constitutional authority to be involved in school curricula or to control jobs in the marketplace. This is why we will abolish the Department of Education and federal meddling in our schools and promote family choice at all levels of learning. This is a quote that I'm going to read again later when I do provide some, you know, more context, you know, just through the process of historicizing, of course, the backlash against the Department of Education. But in 2000, the Republican Liberty Caucus also passed a resolution to abolish the Department of Education. So it is not exactly, you know, this isn't a new thing. They aren't new to this. They're true to this. And it does make a lot of sense that with Trump in the White House, and even now with Elon really in the White House, they are pushing to really abolish and end the Department of Education in the United States. But again, that is just some background on just how long they have been pushing to abolish the Department of Education. When I first conceived of this video, like, you know, just this last week, I was actually initially going to do a video on anti-intellectualism and how I feel like we're falling into the pattern of anti-intellectualism again in the United States. I was looking at the history of anti-intellectualism in the United States, and a lot of people weren't actually really historicizing it in the way that I felt like I wanted to. I wanted to look at the ways in which education has been deprived, you know, certain groups of individuals, you know, certain demographics, for different reasons. I was looking mainly at like women and of course racial minorities, specifically Black Americans in the United States. It's just that looking into the story of the deprivation of education with Black Southerners, especially, you know, dating back to the Reconstruction and the post-Civil War South, the Department of Education was something that really came up. And the reason it did is because the Department of Education was once again actually founded by Jimmy Carter, who just so happened to be the head of the Board of Education in 1955 in Georgia, you know, which is where he was born and raised. In 1955, just a year after the passing of Brown v. Board of Education. And when Jimmy Carter founded the Department of Education, or, you know, the Department of Education was split into its own subsidy, Congress said that the intention of the agency was to strengthen equal education opportunities for students and to improve the quality of education by supplementing the efforts taking place in the state and local districts. So just to give more background to that, I did mention that Title I was a major initiative of the Department of Education. That, of course, falls into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which is part of the War on Poverty under LBJ. And Title I was specifically for the purpose of making sure that students in disenfranchised neighborhoods and communities and districts all had the same access to, you know, really equal access access to educational attainment and achievement that students in, better off and more well-to-do areas would. So that is one of the huge initiatives of the Department of Education. And it does mention here as a subsidy in a way to like substitute the efforts of local and state governments. I will be historicizing here to simply say that the local and state governments that they're talking about were doing literally the bare minimum or nothing at all. But I'd most definitely, in order to really historicize the Department of Education, I do 100% want to look into the way that education had historically been deprived of individuals, specifically Black Americans in the American South, efforts made to educate Black Americans in the South, and then up to and including, of course, the eventual decision by President Jimmy Carter in 1979 to make the Department of Education its own separate thing and specifically mention and push for equal opportunity in education for students across the country who are from disenfranchised and historically marginalized communities. The story of Black education in the United States is a very long and storied one. It's full of a lot of ignorance, most definitely. And it isn't exactly, it's not the most easily digestible story. But again, to really historicize the necessity or let's say the efforts of the Department of Education, I did most definitely want to look into the ways in which Black Americans have historically been denied education in this country. One of the early examples we do see of that is the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740. So the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740, which was adopted by all other Southern antebellum states in that era, simply stated that enslaved people could not be taught to read and write. A formal education was not something that was going to be granted them, which of course, considering that this was the antebellum era South, where slavery was quite literally the economy, it does make a lot of sense that they would have barred education at all from enslaved people. However, after the Nat Turner Rebellion in August of 1831, things do change. And a lot of that happens because Nat Turner was actually literate. So when Nat Turner rebels and you have this revolution that he's, really sort of causing, especially considering that this is only 30 something some odd years after the, revolution in Haiti, there are a lot of fears tied to the, there's just a lot of fears tied to the possibility that you're going to have a lot more slave rebellions. It is worth noting, of course, that states like South Carolina and, several other southern states, they actually have more enslaved people than white people in that era. So those fears really do make a lot of sense. It's just that after the Nat Turner Rebellion, especially with Nat Turner being literate, education is deprived both free and enslaved Black people. So free Black people or the free Negro in that era no longer have access to education. It's something that, once again, it's not only just the fear that the enslaved are going to rebel, but it's also the fear that free Negroes, who are also, of course, marginalized in the societies that they live in, are also going to rebel the more educated that they are. Of course, that, all qualms eventually. You do have the Civil War, and in 1865, you have the mass abolition of slavery. And during the Reconstruction era and the post-Reconstruction era, you do have a huge push. That occurs to educate the freedman. And that is something that you have undertaken from, individuals like Booker T. Washington in particular, people like W.B. Du Bois, many of the early, just the men who really defined the early civil rights movement, who really pushed for the education of Black Americans in the United States. But all of this is met immediately with backlash. There's backlash, of course, because, the fear, of course, coming out of the antebellum period that Black people should not be educated. And I did want to read just a quick news story. This story that I'm going to read appeared on the February 15th, 1868 issue of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette. So I'm going to do a quick unhinged newspapers pivot here, except this isn't funny or anything. It's more irritating. But anyway, this story is entitled Negro Schoolhouse Burned by White Men, Outrages of the Ku Klux Klan. Special dispatch to Cincinnati Gazette. Nashville, February 14th. The colored schoolhouse at Wartrace, Tennessee was burned to ashes on the night of the 11th. On the night of the 11th, Reverend Dr. Burt writes to Jen Garland that the house was undoubtedly set on fire by certain white men who had been heard to swear recently that the Negroes should not have a school and get ahead of the white children. The house was an excellent one and well furnished. A number of the colored people wept bitterly when they saw their schoolhouse in flames. A letter was read today in this city from Attorney General Smithson of Marshall County, Tennessee, which states that bands of armed men known as the Ku Klux Klan are riding about through the county nightly, threatening white Union men and terrifying and abusing the colored people, and swearing that the Negroes shall not vote at the March elections. The civil authorities, he says, can do nothing with them owing to their strength and the secret character of their organization. So this appeared again on the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, and this was February of 1868. So this is still during that Reconstruction era. You actually had, white Union men, like Union soldiers who were down in the South at the time, but things only really do get worse in the post-Reconstruction South, where the Ku Klux Klan and, white supremacy groups like the White League only grow in popularity and membership. And again, a lot of that is tied specifically to making sure that Black students, Black peoples, do not have access to education at all in the South. It is, of course, political and social disenfranchisement. And then, of course, it's saying here that they're not going to vote as well. That is most definitely that political disenfranchisement, is you have Black codes and other things like the grandfather clauses, literacy tests that are all being implemented as you get into the 1870s, 1880s, the 90s, of course, after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. So I just wanted to paint that picture again about, hey, how education had historically been denied Black Americans in this country. But then, of course, once you have the end of the Civil War and you're going into the 1860s and 70s, the post-Reconstruction South, you have this white backlash that is occurring against any education achievement or, access that Black Americans have to education in this country. Despite that, of course, the fight continues. And, there are a lot of progresses that are made definitely with the access that Black children and Black students have to education in this country. As you get into the late 19th century and the very early 20th century, the progressive era, you do have two different schools of thoughts that emerge as far as Black education in this country. And two of the men that represent those two opposing views are, one, Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is somebody who believes specifically in a vocational education for Black Americans, in a vocational education which teaches mainly skills like, carpentry. Those are things that Booker T. Washington definitely emphasized. And then on the other hand, you have individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who actually more so emphasized the education of the mind, where he's thinking of things like the sciences. He's thinking more so of African Americans going to school and getting like white collar jobs and things like that. So not necessarily vocational exclusively as you would have had, with Booker T. Washington. And I really, really want to mention the vocational part because in 1923, Kerry A. Hardy, who was the Florida governor at the time, he attempts to eliminate the liberal arts program at the University of Florida A&M University, which is FAMU, the HBCU in Florida, to make it a purely vocational school. And this is something that's very interesting because what, Governor Hardy is really doing, and he actually mentioned specifically that the fear that Governor Hardy had was that the more educated that Black people got, the more they were likely to leave Florida and really just decimate the state's economy. 1923 is really at the beginning of where you have the rise of the Great Migration, which would take 7 million Black Americans from the rural South to the more urban North. I cannot talk today. From cities like, of course, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, New York, where they're going to be going to those cities for just, higher attainment, better job opportunities, but also just more upward mobility to leave the really oppressive and Jim Crow era South. So, Governor Hardy attacking the liberal arts programs at FAMU and pushing for vocational programs is a way of him simply to say, of course, these are things that we're comfortable with Black people doing. And because of that, they aren't going to be too educated and leave the state and of course completely decimate the economy. The students at FAMU do protest, and I know one of the buildings is burnt on campus, but eventually they are able to restore that program. So W.B. Du Bois and his push for, vocational education, it is fairly controversial with a lot of the more educated Black elite at the times, but it does make a lot of sense because it was actually a pretty popular school of thought overall in the South in that era. In my original, outline for this video where I was gonna, specifically talk about anti-intellectualism, I did also want to really mention the ways in which depriving Black Americans of education in the South actually had an economic bonus for the South, only because Black Americans, specifically being the so overrepresented in the market of sharecropping, were such a huge economic base in the South. So in order to do that, with a lot of Black children who are sharecroppers, it was very, very, very popular for a lot of the men who owned these plantations and things like that to pull Black children out of school. So just to read a couple things, fewer African Americans were enrolled in schools, and Black children were often pulled out of school because they were needed on the farm. Many of their parents were also sharecroppers, and to plant and harvest enough crops, sharecroppers' children had to work alongside their parents. So even if they weren't needed on the farm, the white owner of their farm might pull Black children out if he decided that they were needed for work, or he might simply believe that Black American children did not deserve an education. So there was most definitely that more economic side of it, is saying, these are the people who pick cotton and they do this sort of work for us, so there's no need for them to really get an education. Despite that, however, you do have, there are a lot of successes that occurred during the Jim Crow era as far as Black Americans, really pushing to educate Black children in this country. I did see that in the very early part of the 20th century. There are several states like South Carolina and others that actually didn't even have Black high schools, and up to 80% of Black students in school were actually just up to the 4th grade. So after 4th grade, which is like, you think about it, that's like 10, 11 years old, a lot of them they were just no longer going to school. And I'm assuming that a lot of those 4th graders were probably like grown men and women, who hadn't had access to education before. So that's just some background there. However, in the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington does enlist the help of a friend of his, and that is Julius Rosenwald, who is an American philanthropist. And what Booker T. Washington does is really just, push for Rosenwald's help with helping fund the education of Black Americans in the South. Rosenwald was a huge philanthropist, and what he donates is the Rosenwald Fund, which is really, really focused on rural school building for Black American children. So through the encouragement of Booker T. Washington, this fund was established in 1917. And just to read a couple facts, over $4.4 million in matching funds stimulated construction of more than 5,000 one-room schools and larger ones, as well as shops and teachers' homes, mostly in the South. And the fund required white school boards to agree to operate such schools and to arrange for matching funds, in addition to requiring Black communities to raise funds or donate property and labor to construct the schools. So the Rosenwald funds and these Rosenwald schools, they are a success for the most part. He most definitely pushes, and it most definitely pushes for the, just making sure that Black students have access to schools. They have access to elementary school, middle school, junior high, high school, whatever it would be. And these are mostly one-room schools, but this is a huge luxury, and it is a huge win for a lot of Black American students. A lot of Black American students at that time. However, he does specifically mention here that it also requires that white school boards are on board for, these building and public works projects to help support Black Americans. And I wanted to read a quote here because I really, really wanted to shed light on the way that a lot of them actually approach these initiatives. The quote I'm going to read is from an essay titled "A Brief Moment in the Sun: Mapping White Backlash in the History of K-12 Black Education in the United States." And it was written by Amber M. Neal Stanley from Purdue University and Kristen E. Duncan for Clemson University and Bettina L. Love, Teachers College, Columbia University. So this is an essay that really informs so much of exactly why I'm making this video today. So I'm going to link it below because I felt that it was very, very helpful, of course, to this overall narrative. I want to just shed light on this specific paragraph that they have here. So, as Black communities endured double taxation to ensure that their children were properly educated, white backlash to this perceived progress involved funding for these schools. While Black students' enrollment grew exponentially, so did the disparity in funding for Black students and white students in public schools. During the Jim Crow era, state governments began to increase their funding for white schools significantly. For example, between 1914 and 1932, North Carolina increased its funding for white students from $2.77 per student to $3.11 per student. During the same time period, however, expenditures for Black students remained at $1 per student. While Black communities and the Rosenwald Fund built schools for Black students, the state spent exponentially more funding to build schools for white students at a rapid pace, widening the disparities in educational access between Black and white students. So even though the Rosenwald Fund schools are most definitely a success, a lot of that backlash is also economic. It's simply just at the end of the day that the people in charge of education, these school boards, are white, and they are specifically going to still, and what they do is push to really increase funding for white students while they're not doing the same thing for Black students. That's something that I most definitely wanted to shed light on, the success of the Rosenwald funds and the building of schools, but also a lot of that backlash in the way that at the end of the day, those state school boards were not pushing in any way, shape, or form to fund or increase their expenditures for Black students in their districts and in their states. So there you have it. You have economic, social disparities. Things are not going very well for the average Black student in the South. Obviously, the state cares a lot more on funding the education of white students than its Black constituents. So eventually, what you do have in the United States take shape is the civil rights movement. And one of the biggest wins of that, of course, is the 1954 Brown v. Board decision. And that is just a decision that says that school segregation is illegal. It's not constitutional, obviously, because the boards and the directors who are in charge of it are not actually practicing separate but equal correctly, which is really the big pitfall of segregation in the United States, really, at the end of the day. But after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, you have a huge backlash. And the huge backlash against Brown v. Board is not just the Little Rock Nine. It isn't just Ruby Bridges. I'm not just talking about, the images that we have of some of the early Black students who are admitted into these white schools, and the angry parents in front and all the students and how awful they were treated. I'm actually talking about the ways that Southern districts and most definitely white Southern parents react to segregation mandates. So what you have is the rise of religious schools for white children. All of these religious schools shoot up like exponentially. Private schooling really goes up for white students. And what you have are segregation academies. So I had never heard of a segregation academy before, but they were really popular from the mid 50s to the mid 70s, which is when a lot of them started being attacked and started losing funding and things like that. But segregation academies, they were private schools in the Southern United States that were founded in the mid 20th century by white parents to avoid having their children attend desegregated public schools. And again, they ran mostly from about 1954, the year of Brown v. Board, to 1976. And just to throw some other statistics there, from 1950 to 1958, the South's private school enrollment increased by more than 250,000 students. By 1965, nearly 1 million Southern students attended private schools. By 1969, 300,000 of 7.4 million white students attended segregated school in 11 Southern states. So there is a screenshot that I took, and I'm gonna post it here, of kind of the fear mongering here of oh, don't worry guys, I know they're doing busing and they told us to desegregate and go to school with these people, but there's this other means, guys. We have these segregation schools, this is about Jesus and this is about religion, but it's an all-white school, so your kids do not have to go to school with Blacks. Okay, calm down, Carol, it's not that bad. But a lot of these schools, because they were also considered religious organizations, they were actually tax exempt. So this is a quote that I'm going to read here, where it says, "What is notable is that the taxpayer dollars that finance these all-white schools at the cost of simultaneously creating poorly funded all-Black public school systems in the South. To put it simply, as the financial drain of taxpayer dollars from whites attending segregation academies decimated school systems educating Black children, Black community students and teachers paid a terribly high price to ensure that whites were educated with other whites. So essentially, their tax dollars are going to fund these segregation academies. These are, again, considered religious organizations. There's a lot of ways that they really get, they go around funding and things like that. But these segregated academies are incredibly popular. And these segregated academies are most definitely a big part of why, once again, and I'm gonna get into this, the Department of Education eventually becomes a thing. So let's go ahead and get into that. I did mention earlier that President Jimmy Carter in the 1950s actually served on a school board. So in the 1950s, in 1955, he was actually elected head of the Sumter County School Board in Georgia. And what's very interesting about this is that this is 1955. This is a year after Brown v. Board, when Jimmy Carter is made, the head of, this board in Georgia, which again is one of the states where segregation is like law. I mean, Georgia is about as southern as you get. So when you really think about it, Jimmy Carter, he actually takes a pretty unpopular stance on that board. And that is because Jimmy Carter actually supports the desegregation of schools. However, he did very little to support it while he was on that board. I'm sure there was a lot of opposition there, but he believed that education was an essential human right and could help prevent violence. That was really Jimmy Carter's stance on education. And I did want to read another thing about Jimmy Carter that I was able to discover during my research here. So as governor of Georgia from 1971 to 1975, Carter actually worked to comply with federal desegregation mandates. That would have been the era of busing, and when, these segregation schools, these Christian schools, were really, really, really popular in the South. As president, Carter sought to address educational disparities and strengthen historically Black colleges and universities, and he also pushed for fair housing and banking policies and increased funding for historically Black colleges. So that is one thing I want to shed light on when it comes to Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was a Southern man. He was a man from Georgia, just with some common sense, I guess. And what Jimmy Carter, it's very interesting that Jimmy Carter happens to be in charge of a school board during the 1950s, right when you have, the Brown v. Board of Education happened, and everybody, I'm sure, was running around like headless chickens. And then, of course, he becomes governor of the state and does actually focus on funding for historically Black colleges and universities, like, let's say Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, all of which were, are all HBCUs in Georgia. But that is just the background on Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter's push and really his belief that education is this right that everybody deserves access to. You can't really say that I can't really say that I'm really surprised that Jimmy Carter is somebody who eventually in the late 1970s decides to really take the Department of Education and make it a priority. We're talking 20-something odd years after the Brown v. Board decision. This is a man who sat on the head of a school board right when desegregation was, first really taking shape, was the governor of a state during the era of busing and how controversial that was specifically. And then here we are in the late 70s, and he's looking to really establish the Department of Education in the United States. And again, the Department of Education, as I read earlier, it substituted a lot of the efforts being made by local and state governments in a very, very hostile state government that seems to be pushing for these segregation schools and pushing for these private Christian academies. What you have is a state or a local government that does not care overall, and historically has not cared about the education of the marginalized groups in that state. Realistically speaking, the Department of Education was established by Jimmy Carter more so to address the complete and utter failures of the Southern education school boards. These were school boards that, as I read, had historically neglected the education of individuals and marginalized groups in those states because they really, truthfully, were, of course, trying to establish and maintain the status quo of white supremacy. So the Department of Education being established under the former governor of Georgia, who had once again sat as the head of a school board in the 1950s, was most definitely Jimmy Carter's way of having the federal government overlook states and local practices, especially in those southern states that really had done, once again, a really piss poor job at actually educating their populace correctly. That is really, just through my research, where the Department of Education under Jimmy Carter really comes from. I think my camera is heating again. I see that gauge there. But yes, Carter was a one-term president, and after Carter left office, Ronald Reagan would be the president of the United States for the next 8 years until 1988, and obviously there's nothing good I have to say about that. But Ronald Reagan, off the bat, pushes for the dismantling of the Department of Education. And I just wanted to shed light on a couple things here. So one, Ronald Reagan, him specifically talking about cutting federal spending for the Department of Education makes a lot of sense. When Ronald Reagan was actually running, he specifically mentioned that he preferred local preferences of the way to run schools over federal ones. He actually condemned busing for desegregation, and he also threatened to veto the prolonging of the Civil Rights Act, which is news to me because I generally didn't even know that there was a expiration date on a Civil Rights Act. But you also have Southern representatives, specifically individuals like Trent Lott and Strom Thurmond, Strom Thurmond, a whole mess. But, these are individuals that are pushing Ronald Reagan to also make sure that the tax exempt status of these segregation schools is kept. Because once again, a lot of these schools are facing lawsuits and things like that because they're pushing very openly segregation and excluding Black children. So it makes a lot of sense that people are suing them, and they're essentially saying you do not get a tax exempt status if you are practicing something that is quite literally illegal in this country. Ronald Reagan also tries to allow Bob Jones University, which is a segregated Southern school, to reclaim federal tax credits that had long been denied due to racial discrimination policies. So Ronald Reagan, really hitting the floor and immediately pushing to dismantle the Department of Education, which had been established under Carter 3 business days before he was in office, makes a lot of sense because Ronald Reagan is somebody who I most definitely associate with being, that kind of leader that was very, very concerned about states' rights and things like that. And I think that most of us, especially minorities, Black people, definitely, when you hear states' rights, it's very obvious what they're talking about. They're not going to flat out say it, but it's most definitely the states' rights to disenfranchise individuals. It's the states' rights to really practice bigotry. And during the Ronald Reagan presidency, you're still fresh from, obviously things like busing and desegregation. And a lot of Southerners are also very, very angry that the government was meddling in their way of life anyway. This was segregation. It was working for us, as they always say, so the government should have never stepped in. That's the way a lot of them feel. And they do view the Department of Education under Carter as completely overstepping its bounds. So the Reagan administration pushing for the abolishing very early of the Department of Education most definitely makes a lot of sense. In 1982, Reagan, during his State of the Union speech, actually called for abolishing the education department. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. So in his State of the Union speech, Ronald Reagan calls for the end of the Department of Education. Reagan says he believes that the decision about education should be made at the local level and that the federal government should play only a minor role in the nation's schools. That speech stirs a debate in Congress. In the end, the department is funded, although at lower levels than in the past. So Congress and the House at this time were actually more so Democratic. They weren't necessarily Republican. So he was never actually able to abolish the Department of Education. And we're going to see what happens, under 47. But that is Ronald Reagan in his State of the Union speech specifically saying that, it is up to the state and local governments to decide how they want to run their schools. Let's do a quick recap here of what we've discussed so far. Black Americans had historically been denied adequate education in the southern United States. State and local governments had done everything that they could to make sure that Black American children were disenfranchised from education achievement in their states. Jimmy Carter, who is somebody who served as the head of a state board in Georgia, one of those states, becomes president after his tenure of being a governor in that state, and really establishes and pushes and drives for the Department of Education because he believes that the federal government should most definitely have a hand in the way that state and local governments run their education, because he has been in the thick of it and has seen it. And then we have a president, Ronald Reagan, come up right after that, who is straight up trying to abolish this Department of Education again. Because, why? He believes that state and local governments are going to make the best call about the education of their pupils, because guess what? That's what they have always done in the South. I'm gonna go ahead and read that quote from the GOP in 1996 again, where the GOP platform read, "The federal government has no constitutional authority to be involved in school curricula or to control jobs in the marketplace. This is why we will abolish the Department of Education and federal meddling in our schools and promote family choice at all levels of learning." LOL, shocker, shocker. One of the things that always makes me laugh is just the mention of like federal meddling, because I think that's just one of the things that Southerners, racist Southerners, have always used to avoid being called like prejudice. It's never, this is how I feel about things and this is why I'm prejudiced. It's, I just want it to be up to the state. I want it to be up to the local government. And considering the state and local governments in the South have done a wonderful job at educating the black students there. I mean, the material is there, you know, the receipts are very, very lengthy. It does make a lot of sense why people like Ronald Reagan, who was anti-busing, of course, in the GOP, would be pushing for the Department of Education, because why have the federal government involved if we've all done such a good job anyway? The whole thing is, I mean, it's just so absolutely ridiculous to me, but this is how we got to the Department of Education, and this is where we're also seeing the backlash, of course, to the Department of Education. And it is once again one of those things where they're very clearly saying this needs to be up to the state and local governments. Just wanted to point that out. There's an article by the writer Diamond Walker for the Palm Beach Post, and it's titled "Donald Trump Wants U.S. Department of Education Abolished: What That Means for Florida." And there are 4 reasons that they give here for Donald Trump wanting, well, 3, that for wanting the Department of Education abolished. So Donald Trump has expressed a desire to eliminate the Department of Education, claiming it has been overtaken by radicals, zealots, and Marxists. He argues that the agency wastes taxpayer money and oversteps by involving the federal government in local education decisions, the Associated Press reported. Trump's push for the department's closure is rooted in its perceived role in promoting liberal ideologies in schools. So once again, this most definitely falls back into the whole meddling into state and local government things that we're constantly seeing as a rallying cry for individuals dating back to the era of segregation and, of course, busing and desegregation and, you know, really just the desegregation of schools in the South. So I'm not necessarily going to go into those reasons specifically because this video isn't really about that. What I really wanted to do, of course, with this video was just historicize why the Department of Education was implemented in the first place, you know, why it became this separate department under the Carter administration. One, what it actually does, because that's not something that I could necessarily define, and I don't know if a lot of other people can really define what the Department of Education can do. However, over the course of my research, it most definitely opened my eyes to why the Department of Education really became a thing and its own separate thing in the first place. And once again, it being implemented by a former Georgia governor who happened to be in charge of a school board in the 1950s is honestly really crazy. If they do move forward with the demolishing the Department of Education, however, I'm not necessarily somebody who believes for a second that like Southern school departments are I don't necessarily, you know, and it's just, maybe it's that part of me, and I'm trying to be a very hopeful person, but I'm just not somebody who necessarily believes that, you know, Southern school districts have the best interest of all their pupils at heart. The Title I, which is of course to specifically push for making sure that there's equal educational opportunity for all students regardless of their districts and, you know, where they live, and those who may be part of historically marginalized groups. I don't necessarily think that's something that should be left to the hands of state and local governments, because just truthfully speaking, let's just look at the rap sheet here. Most of these states really have done a very piss poor job at handling education. But once again, I'm not really surprised that it's a conversation, and not surprised that it's something that is happening under this administration. But as I always say, stay woke, keep your eyes open, make sure that you're reading, make sure that you're educating yourself. I'm out of college, thank the Lord. I cannot imagine being a kindergartner or first grader right now. But that was just my video of really just trying to historicize and make sense of the Department of Education, what they do, the social political climate that really brought about the department. It's so funny that I was just like reading this, and obviously Jimmy Carter passed away very recently, and I heard really wonderful things about him, but it is very interesting for me to be doing my research this weekend. And I really commend him for what he did with the Department of Education and really pushing for the Department of Education, because at the end of the day, this was a Southern man from Georgia, and I'm sure he was well aware, that they were cutting up. He was well aware they were cutting up. He knew he had to do something, okay? Like, it's crazy. And then, of course, to like that weird juxtaposition between him and then Ronald Reagan, who, let me not even get started on that man, all the way until Donald Trump today. It's ridiculous. But definitely just wanted to shed light there to not necessarily historicize the Department of Education, but historicize the necessity of that department, I guess, and why it was implemented in the first place. I hope you guys enjoyed that, though. I know it was pretty research heavy. There were a lot of statistics and things there, but I definitely wanted to shed light on that. But again, I want to thank you guys as always for watching as it historicizes. I've seen an uptick in my viewership recently. I know it's nothing crazy, but I just like seeing that. I check pretty often. But thank you guys so much as always for the support, and you guys have, I hope you guys have an amazing week. So yeah.